James stared at the credit card statement in disbelief, his hand trembling as he scrolled through the list of charges. Fancy dinners at high-end restaurants he'd never heard of, expensive hotel stays, and luxury purchases he wouldn't dream of buying all made in the last 3 months. His stomach churned as the realization hit him like a freight train. These weren't mistakes, and they certainly weren't his expenses. Someone else was enjoying the fruits of his hard work, and the only person who had access to his card was his wife, Melissa. James had always prided himself on being a provider. He'd built his small construction business from the ground up, working grueling hours and sacrificing weekends to ensure Melissa could live comfortably. She didn't need to work, and he thought that was what she wanted, a life where she could focus on her passions without financial worry. But now, staring at the shocking amount of money she'd drained from their accounts, he realized how deeply misplaced his trust had been. He closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. Something was off. Melissa had been distant lately, brushing off his attempts to connect and spending more time with friends or at the gym. He'd chalked it up to stress or boredom, but now, with this evidence glaring back at him, he couldn't ignore the gnawing suspicion clawing at his gut. "James, are you okay?" Melissa's voice rang out from the living room. She stepped into his office, her face composed but her eyes betraying a hint of guilt. "Yeah, fine," he said, forcing a tight smile. He couldn't confront her without concrete proof. He needed to be smart about this. Over the next week, James began piecing together the puzzle. He scoured receipts, checked timestamps, and cross-referenced her stories with her girls' nights and yoga classes. Each lie unraveled her facade a little more. The nail in the coffin came when he tracked her location using the Find My Phone app one evening. Melissa had told him she was out having dinner with her friend Rachel, but her phone pinged at a 5-star hotel downtown instead. James clenched his jaw, his knuckles white as he gripped his phone. Enough was enough. The next morning, James contacted a divorce attorney, laying out everything he'd discovered. He wanted to protect himself before confronting Melissa. The lawyer assured him they'd start the process immediately and advised him to gather as much evidence as possible. That evening, Melissa waltzed into the house carrying shopping bags from high-end boutiques, her face lighting up when she saw him in the kitchen. "Hey babe," she said, kissing him on the cheek. "I got a few things for our trip next month." James stiffened under her touch. "Trip, huh? Sounds like fun. How about we sit down and go over the budget for it?" Melissa hesitated, her smile faltering. "Oh, we don't need to do that tonight. I'm exhausted. Let's talk tomorrow." "Sure," James said, forcing a casual tone. "Tomorrow." He watched her retreat to their bedroom, her expensive heels clicking on the hardwood floor. His blood boiled at the audacity. She wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. The next day, James adjusted his schedule to leave work early. He wasn't just going to confront her, he was going to expose her. He planted a small voice recorder in the living room, knowing she often made calls to her friends during the day. When he returned that evening, James retrieved the recorder and listened, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yeah, babe. He has no idea," Melissa's voice purred. "James is so clueless. Honestly, I deserve this. Do you know how boring it is being stuck at home while he works all the time? At least you make me feel alive." James stopped the recording, his breath shaky but his resolve solid. He'd suspected it, but hearing her say it aloud twisted the knife even deeper. That night, he initiated his plan. "Melissa, let's talk about the budget for that trip," he said casually after dinner. "James, is this really necessary?" she replied, annoyance creeping into her tone. "Absolutely," he slid the printed credit card statements across the table. "Want to explain these? Because I know I didn't spend $3,000 on a spa day." Melissa's face turned red, her eyes darting to the charges. I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can. Just like you explained being at Rachel's last week when you were actually at the Hilton downtown." His voice was sharp, cutting through her stammered excuses. "Don't even try lying to me, Melissa. I already know." Her lips parted, but no words came out. For once, she was speechless. "You spent my hard-earned money on your affair," James continued, his voice rising. "You lied to my face, disrespected our marriage, and treated me like a fool. How long has this been going on? How long have you been screwing around while I've been working my ass off to give you everything? James, Save it, he snapped, slamming his hand against the table. I trusted you. I gave you everything. And this is how you repay me. Tears welled in her eyes, but James didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. I'm done, Melissa. I already called a lawyer. You're going to pay for what you've done literally and figuratively. I'm taking back every cent you wasted, and you'll be lucky if you walk away with the clothes on your back. Melissa gasped. A lawyer? James, please, we can work this out. I made a mistake, but I love you. Don't even say that, he growled. You don't love me. You love my money, my hard work, and the comfort I've provided. But you don't love me. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Melissa's quiet sobs. James stood, towering over her. This is over. I'll be moving out tomorrow. And don't think for a second that you'll keep the house. You financed your little love affair with my money, and I'm taking it all back. Every last dime. He left her there at the table, her face buried in her hands. As he packed his things that night, James felt a strange sense of relief. The woman he thought he loved was gone, replaced by someone he didn't recognize. But he knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to let her destroy him. This was just the beginning. The next morning, James woke early, his mind already racing with the tasks ahead. He'd spent the night at a nearby motel, leaving Melissa behind in the house he'd worked so hard for. He didn't want to share another second of his life under the same roof as her. Now, with a clear head and a renewed sense of purpose, he was determined to ensure she faced the consequences of her betrayal. By mid-morning, James sat in his lawyer's office, a modest yet professional space with dark oak furniture and shelves lined with legal books. Janet, his attorney, was sharp and efficient, her no-nonsense demeanor exactly what he needed. I've filed the initial paperwork, Janet said, sliding a folder across the desk. Given the evidence you've provided, the financial records, the voice recording, and her admission during your confrontation, we have a strong case. The judge will take all of it into account when determining the division of assets. James nodded, his jaw tight. I don't want her walking away with anything more than she's entitled to. She doesn't deserve a penny of what I've built. Janet leaned forward, her gaze steady. She'll fight this, James. Women like Melissa don't give up easily, especially when they've become accustomed to a certain lifestyle. Be prepared for her to play the victim, to twist the narrative. She can try, James said coldly, but I'm done being the fool. She won't manipulate me again. Later that afternoon, James returned to the house to pick up the rest of his belongings. He entered with his key, the familiar scent of the home now tainted with memories of Melissa's deceit. She was in the living room, perched on the edge of the couch, her face pale and drawn. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice shaky. I'm here to get my things, James replied, his tone clipped. Don't worry, I'll be out of your way soon enough. James, please, she stood, her hands clasped in front of her. Can't we just talk? I know I messed up, but I want to fix this. I want to fix us. James laughed bitterly, his eyes narrowing. Fix us? There is no us, Melissa. Not after what you did. You didn't just cheat on me, you lied, you stole, and you treated me like an ATM while you played house with someone else. And now you suddenly want to fix things? Spare me. Tears streamed down her face, but James remained unmoved. He turned his back on her and headed toward the bedroom to pack. Melissa followed, her voice rising in desperation. I made a mistake. I wasn't thinking clearly. You were always working, and I felt so alone. I know that's not an excuse, but I wasn't trying to hurt you. I needed something more. James spun around, his eyes blazing. Something more? I gave you everything, Melissa. I worked my ass off so you could sit at home and do whatever you wanted. I thought I was giving you the life you deserved, but clearly I was wrong. You didn't deserve any of it. She flinched at his words, but he didn't stop. Do you even understand what you've done? You've destroyed everything we built. All for what? Some fling? Some thrill? Was it worth it? Was he worth it? Melissa's lip quivered, but she didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes. That's what I thought, James said, his voice dripping with disdain. You don't even have the courage to defend your actions because you know how disgusting they are." He threw the last of his clothes into a suitcase and zipped it shut. As he carried it down the hall, Melissa trailed behind him, her pleas growing more frantic. "James, please. Don't do this. Don't walk away from us. I still love you." He stopped abruptly, turning to face her one last time. "You don't love me, Melissa. You love the comfort I provided. You love the idea of me, but not the man I am. If you loved me, you wouldn't have betrayed me like this. So save your tears and your empty words. I'm done." James walked out the door without looking back. For the next few weeks, James threw himself into his work, using the long hours and physical labor as an outlet for his anger. His friends and coworkers noticed the change in him, but they didn't press. He wasn't ready to talk about it, and he appreciated their understanding. Meanwhile, Melissa had tried everything to contact him: texts, calls, even showing up at his worksite once. Each time, he ignored her or had her turned away. He didn't owe her anything anymore. The divorce proceedings moved quickly, thanks to Janet's diligence and the mountain of evidence against Melissa. The judge ruled in James's favor, granting him the majority of their assets, including the house. Melissa was left with little more than her personal belongings and a fraction of their savings. On the day the divorce was finalized, Melissa showed up at his new apartment unannounced. James opened the door, his expression hardening when he saw her. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice trembling. "I know it doesn't mean much now, but I'm sorry, James, for everything." James studied her for a moment, his gaze unyielding. "You're right. It doesn't mean much. But I hope, for your sake, you've learned something from this. I'm moving on, Melissa. You should too." He closed the door on her, the finality of the action filling him with a sense of closure. For the first time in months, he felt free. In the weeks that followed, James began rebuilding his life on his terms. He focused on expanding his business, reconnecting with old friends, and rediscovering the passions he'd neglected during his marriage. He wasn't bitter or broken, he was determined. As for Melissa, the last James heard, she was struggling to adjust to her new reality. The man she'd risked everything for had disappeared the moment her financial security evaporated, leaving her to face the consequences of her choices alone. James didn't dwell on her fate. He was too busy building a better future for himself, one where he'd never again let someone take advantage of his trust and generosity. James sat quietly in his truck outside the old diner on the edge of town, the engine humming softly. His fingers tapped the steering wheel as he stared at his phone. There was a message notification from Rachel, Melissa's closest friend. He'd reached out to Rachel during the divorce proceedings, hoping to uncover more of Melissa's lies, but she hadn't returned his calls until now. Her message was brief but hinted at something significant. "Meet me at the diner. We need to talk. It's about Melissa." He hesitated for a moment, then stepped out of the truck. The brisk evening air bit at his skin, but it didn't bother him. His curiosity outweighed his discomfort. Inside, Rachel was waiting in a booth near the back, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. She looked up as he approached, her expression equal parts nervous and apologetic. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly as he slid into the seat across from her. "Let's get to it," Rachel James replied, his tone sharp. "What do you know?" She glanced around the diner, ensuring no one was close enough to overhear. "I wasn't going to say anything at first. I thought it wasn't my place. But after seeing what she did to you, I can't keep quiet anymore." James leaned forward, his jaw tightening. "Spill it." Rachel sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. "Melissa didn't just cheat on you with one guy. There were at least 2 others. One of them was a man named Greg. He's married." James's stomach churned. Of course she found someone else willing to stoop to her level. "Who's the other one?" Rachel hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "It was someone from your company." The words hit James like a sledgehammer. His business had always been his sanctuary, the one place where things made sense. The idea that someone from his crew could betray him like this was almost too much to process. "Who?" he demanded, his voice low and furious. His name's Austin, Rachel admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. He's one of your newer hires, right? She met him when they ran into each other at some event. I didn't know it escalated until she bragged about it during one of our girls' nights. She thought it was funny. Some kind of power move. James clenched his fists, fighting to keep his composure. She slept with someone I hired. Someone I gave a job to. Rachel nodded. I'm sorry, I should have told you sooner. No, James said firmly, his voice icy. You shouldn't have waited at all. You knew what she was doing, and you said nothing. You're as bad as she is. Rachel flinched at the accusation, her face falling. I didn't want to get involved. Save it, James snapped, standing abruptly. You made your choice when you stayed quiet. I don't need your excuses. He turned and walked out, ignoring the stares from the other patrons. Back in his truck, his mind raced. He thought he'd uncovered everything, but this revelation cut even deeper. It wasn't just Melissa's betrayal, it was the knowledge that someone he'd employed, someone he'd trusted to represent his business, had also been complicit. The next morning, James arrived at the worksite earlier than usual. He parked his truck and leaned against it, waiting. One by one, his crew arrived, greeting him with nods and waves. Then Austin pulled up, stepping out of his beat-up sedan with a casual grin. James's blood boiled as he watched the younger man stroll toward the group. He didn't wait. He crossed the distance in long, purposeful strides, stopping Austin in his tracks. Morning, Boss Austin said, his grin faltering at James's intense expression. Don't boss me, James growled. We need to talk. Now. Austin glanced nervously at the other workers who were beginning to notice the tension. Yeah, okay. James gestured toward the side of the site, away from prying eyes. Once they were out of earshot, he rounded on Austin, his voice a low hiss. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Austin blinked, feigning confusion. I don't know what you're talking about. Cut the crap, Austin, James snapped. I know about you and Melissa. Austin paled, his bravado crumbling. Look, man, I didn't mean for it to happen. She came on to me. And you just went along with it, James's voice rose, his anger barely contained. You knew she was my wife. You knew, and you did it anyway. Austin stammered, his hands shaking. I'm sorry. It was a mistake. It didn't mean anything. James laughed bitterly. Didn't mean anything. You think that makes it better? You disrespected me, my marriage, and this job. You're done here. Wait, James Austin started, but James cut him off with a glare that could melt steel. I don't care what you have to say. Pack your things and get off my site. Now. Austin hesitated for a moment, then nodded silently, his shoulders slumping as he walked away. James watched him go, the anger in his chest finally beginning to subside. By the end of the day, James had informed his crew of Austin's termination, citing gross misconduct without divulging the personal details. He refused to let Melissa's actions taint the reputation he'd worked so hard to build. That evening, as James sat in his apartment, his phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a number he didn't recognize. I heard what you did today. I'm sorry, James. For everything. He stared at the message, debating whether to respond. Ultimately, he deleted it without replying. He didn't need apologies from Melissa or anyone else. He needed to move forward. The divorce settlement had already left Melissa scrambling, and now, without the support of her so-called friends and lovers, she was beginning to reap what she'd sown. As for James, he felt a renewed sense of clarity. He'd lost a lot, but he hadn't lost himself. That was something Melissa could never take away. James pulled into the driveway of the house that had once been his home. The front yard, overgrown with weeds, mirrored the disarray Melissa had brought into his life. He stepped out of his truck, the weight of the past months heavy on his shoulders, and walked to the front door. He had been summoned back here by a terse email from Melissa's lawyer, claiming there was a matter requiring his immediate attention. The door opened before he could knock. Melissa stood there, her face gaunt and her posture uncharacteristically meek. She wore a sweater that hung loose on her frame, a stark contrast to the confident, polished woman she used to be. "James," she began, her voice trembling. "Thank you for coming." "Save it," he said, brushing past her. "What's this about? I don't have time for games." Melissa closed the door behind him, wringing her hands. It's about the house." James stopped in the middle of the living room, his eyes scanning the familiar space now stripped of warmth. The furniture was sparse, the walls bare. It looked like a shell of what it had once been. "What about the house?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I can't keep up with the payments," Melissa admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought I could, but after everything, it's too much. The lawyer said I should tell you before things get worse." James turned to face her, his expression hard. "Worse? You mean worse than you cheating, lying, and blowing through money you didn't earn? What, Melissa, am I supposed to feel sorry for you now?" She flinched at his words, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know it would turn out like this." He scoffed. "Of course you didn't. You thought you'd ride off into the sunset with your flings and my money. How'd that work out for you?" Melissa's lip quivered, but she said nothing. James took a step closer, his voice rising. "You didn't just ruin our marriage. You ruined your own life, and now you're crawling back to me because you can't handle the mess you made. What do you expect me to do? Fix it. Bail you out?" "I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I need help." James stared at her, his chest tight with anger and disbelief. "Unbelievable. You're still thinking about yourself. You don't care about what you did to me, to us. All you care about is what I can do for you." Melissa sank onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "I don't know how to fix this, James. I don't know what to do." "That's your problem, not mine," he said coldly. "I've already moved on. The house? Let it go into foreclosure for all I care. It's not my responsibility anymore." He turned to leave, but her voice stopped him. "Wait, there's something else." James froze, his hand on the doorknob. "What now?" Melissa hesitated, her face pale. I found out I'm being sued." James's brow furrowed. "Sued? By who?" "Greg's wife," Melissa admitted, her voice trembling. "She found out about the affair and wants to sue me for alienation of affection. I didn't even know that was a thing." James let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, it's a thing, and it's exactly what you deserve." "Please, James," she pleaded, standing. "I don't know what to do. I can't afford a lawyer. I'm already drowning." He turned to face her, his jaw tight. "And why should I care? You didn't think about the consequences when you were sneaking around with Greg or Austin or whoever else. You didn't think about me or this marriage or anything else that mattered. So tell me, Melissa, why should I lift a finger to help you now?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she sank back onto the couch, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. James shook his head, his anger giving way to a cold sense of finality. "You made your choices, Melissa. Now you have to live with them." Without another word, he walked out the door and didn't look back. A week later, James sat in a small cafe downtown, sipping his coffee as he reviewed blueprints for an upcoming project. The construction business had picked up considerably, and he'd even hired a few new crew members to handle the workload. Austin's betrayal had stung, but replacing him had been easier than expected. James. He looked up to see a familiar face, Rachel. She stood by his table, her expression hesitant. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone flat. I wanted to apologize," she said, sitting down without waiting for an invitation. "I know I messed up by staying quiet about Melissa. I should have told you." James leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're right, you should have. But it's a little late for apologies, don't you think?" Rachel nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I get that, I do. But I wanted you to know I've cut ties with her. After everything she did, I couldn't stay friends with her." James raised an eyebrow. "And why should I believe that?" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "Look, she's been calling and texting me nonstop. I haven't responded to a single one. He glanced at the screen, noting the long list of messages from Melissa. Most of them were desperate pleas for help, while others were angry rants. Good for you, James said, his tone indifferent. But that doesn't change what happened. I know, Rachel said softly. I just wanted to clear the air. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. James shrugged, taking another sip of his coffee. Apology accepted. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do. Rachel nodded and stood, her expression a mix of relief and regret. As she walked away, James returned his focus to the blueprints, his thoughts already shifting to the future. Melissa's life continued to unravel. The lawsuit from Greg's wife moved forward, and with no funds to hire a decent lawyer, Melissa was left to fend for herself. The stress took its toll, and she was forced to sell off her remaining belongings just to stay afloat. Meanwhile, James flourished. His business thrived, his social circle expanded, and he even began dating again. The scars from Melissa's betrayal remained, but they no longer defined him. He had reclaimed his life, piece by piece, and built something stronger in its place.